Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Navigating Education webinar series. And please let us know in the chat. You'll actually do it in the Q&A, where you're from, where you're joining us from. We always like to know who our audience is. And my name is Dr. Melissa Durtschi here at Navigating Education, hosting this webinar. And our office is based in Colorado State, and we focus on empowering students with knowledge, students and families with knowledge for their educational journey so that they can make choices for their educational path. We accomplish that in two major ways. First, through evaluations for learning disabilities. And then the second way that we do that is consultative services such as attending IEP 504 meetings to help families. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get into our webinar today. Our format today is, after I finish up the housekeeping items, we're going to turn the time over to our guest speaker, Clarrisa Constantine, and then we will also have a question and answer. So as Clarrisa is sharing her presentation, if you have questions that come up, please put them into the Q&A. We will make sure that we monitor those and ask Clarrisa to follow up on questions that we have. And then any handouts or things like that for this webinar will be linked in the video on our YouTube channel at Navigating EDU. You can join us and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We also have lots of other webinars for this webinar series there. Today, I am pleased to share with you one of my good friends, Clarrisa Constantine. She is from ParenTween. She's the owner and founder of ParenTween Connection here based in Colorado, but it's all across even the world, not just the United States. And I encourage those that are joining us to tell us what your role is with neurodiverse children and teens, tweens, and so I want to tell you about how I know Clarrisa. I actually met Clarrisa and her husband in a business networking. And you know, when you meet one of those people that just gets you and you get them, I feel like that definitely has happened with Clarrisa, and I'm honored to have her on our webinar today for me to share her with you and her wonderful organization, talking about this idea of connection specifically with our teens and tweens, because we all know as parents that can be a different type of, you know, you have the toddler age and then you have these teens and tweens, and we want to help them so much. And so giving perspectives from others. So Clarrisa is going to tell us all about ParenTween Connection. And we are going to turn the time over to her to tell her about herself tell us about herself, and then also about this topic of connection. We'll turn the time over to you, Clarrisa, and just make sure to share your screen. We're excited to get to know you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Durtschi. You know, you said when you just meet somebody that you know just gets you. That's exactly how Joe and I both felt when we met you initially. And I think part of that is because we're all driven by our own experiences, whether it was ours as children or as we advocate for the children in our lives. And I think there's a unique energy to folks who are driven by more than quote unquote just building a business. And so I definitely feel that with you. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm glad to have you as one of our trusted experts at ParenTween Connection as well. So just by way of a short background so that folks kind of have a sense of how ParenTween Connection came to be and why this is so important to me. My mom and I had a rough relationship. We did not navigate my teenage years well. We did not navigate my young adult or my not so young adult years much better. We lost that connection. As I said at her services a few years ago when she passed, I never doubted that she loved me. I never doubted that she wanted what was best for me. But her definition of what was best for me and my definition of what was best for me frequently didn't line up, and we fell into patterns of behavior. And I own my part on that as well. You know, being a kid, I didn't know any better. Therapy wasn't a thing when I was a kid, or, you know, relationship coaching wasn't a thing for us. We fell into a pattern of the way I would describe it is by saying that we both spent more time trying to prove that we were each right about what was best for me. And in that process, lost the focus on being kind and loving and connected. And it sucks. Like, I'm just going to put it plainly that there was a lot of lost years. There was a lot of lost time that I wish could have been different. And so that's a big piece of what drives me in creating ParenTween Connection. I know you know the story. ParenTween Connection came out of a conversation with friends of mine and my husband's who were navigating some tough stuff with their own daughter. She was 15 and she was doing absolutely everything that you don't want your own 15-year-old daughter doing. And mom was terrified. She was terrified of losing her daughter, like in terms of the relationship, but she was also terrified of the outcome of the decisions that she was making. And she said, I just wish I had other parents to talk to. And through time, I came to recognize she meant that in two ways. Number one, I wish I had other parents just to be like, dude, what is going on with my teenager? In a way that, you weren't going to be judged by the fact that your kid was doing things that you just can't believe that they're doing, but they're doing, because by the way, they're all doing it, just saying. But she also wanted other parents, or she wanted connection to folks like you and other professionals, so that when she was like, where do I go? She didn't know where to go to find the professional support that she needed. So that really is the backstory to what brings us to ParenTween Connection. And the foundations of connection, which we're going to be focusing on today, came out of a conversation I had with myself. One piece I didn't mention in my backstory is that I've actually been an SAT and ACT coach for 25 years. So I've literally worked with tens of thousands of students at this point through a very high intensity period of life. Some, I'm sure many more than even realized it at the time, who deal with neurodiversity, and families who deal with neurodiversities. And there's just a super intense time frame in the college admissions process. And a lot of times the kids would talk to me about stuff that they weren't ready to talk to their parents about, or we'd start talking a lot about mindset or some of the beliefs that were blocking their capacity to move forward in certain areas, oftentimes because of undiagnosed learning difficulties at a young age, or they just had a rotten math teacher and so they think they suck at math, or whatever the case may be. And so I sat down with myself and I was like, all right, self, why is it that you have come to a point that like you feel like you sometimes play more therapist than tutor? I'm not a therapist. I am a certified life coach, but like I've had students literally just in the last few months say to me, gosh, I feel like we hired an SAT coach and I got a therapist with the deal, because we talk about all the things that are relevant to the test prep, but a lot of times that's real life too. And so the foundations of connection came out of this inquiry, this self-inquiry of why do kids feel comfortable talking to me or my husband, who's a teen life coach, teen mentor? Why do they want to talk about things with us before they're ready to talk with their parents about these things? Full disclosure, I'm not a mom. Joe and I have not taken that step. And so there are a lot of folks who are like, but you're not a mom. And you're right, I'm not. I don't know the challenges that come with having my own offspring, biological or adopted. I also don't know the joys. But sometimes that gives me a remove that remove allows me to see things a little bit differently because I don't have those same emotional ties to the kids. So
Clarrisa, I wanted to just to mention, I love how you say that, how you mentioned that they're talking through all of these almost social emotional things, right? Before they can get to the SAT. That's so much what we see. And I sometimes feel like I'm on a soapbox about it, trying to tell people that we've got to make these connections before we can access the great learning that the kids can do, because they're blocked for some reason. And that's not just our teens and tweens, that's human nature in general. And so this connection is so vital. And I know we all want it. So I'm just excited to hear about what types of the foundations of connections you can share with us, because you're right. You have to start there, and then we can get into getting through those blocks and then going to, for instance, with the SAT and ACT stuff.
Absolutely. Because here's the thing. We're humans.
Mm-hmm.
Before we're students. We're humans before we're professionals. We're humans before we're parents. Okay, we're humans when we become children, clearly, right? But like, we are human beings before we're anything else. And if we cannot connect with other human beings, how can we? It's like if you don't have the gas in the car, okay, electric accepting, right? Like if we don't have some kind of fuel in the car, how does the car move? How do we move forward in any fashion? We have to address those human beingnesses, if you will, before we can make any other kinds of strides.
Yep.
So To folks who are listening, I want you to think about whom you'd like to have a stronger connection with. Now, obviously, Dr. Durtschi and I work with kids. So in this case, we're going to be talking more about the adult-teen relationship. But these foundations, I believe, again, they're the foundations of human connection. I think they apply in any environment, whether you want a stronger relationship with your own parent. That's my mom in the upper left-hand corner and my dad in the lower left-hand corner. My best friend in the middle and the top, we were dressed up as witches for our West International Singing Competition we were in back in October. My husband in the middle on the bottom. My dogs, some of this, like having patience with your animals sometimes comes more easily than having patience with your children. At least that's what I've seen. But, there's also an aspect of connection with yourself. That's why I put a picture of myself in there, because sometimes we need to take a step back and think about how are we connecting with our own humanity, or if you believe in a greater spirit, whatever that looks like for you, your connection with your higher self, if you will. I think these are all applicable. But think about who you would like to have a stronger connection with. But then I also want you to think about someone with whom you've felt a strong connection over time. It could have been a mentor. It could be a best friend. It could be a guide in a house of worship, potentially. It could be your own higher self or your own God, if that's part of your world. And I want you to think about why you felt connected to that person. What did that person provide to you that others didn't? And just kind of like mull that over for a moment. And then I want you to think back to the person that you'd like to have a stronger relationship with. And as we go through this, I want you to think about how you're showing up to provide for that other person what the person who gave it to you gave. Does that make sense? Like, are you emulating what that person you felt really strongly connected to, what they gave to you? Are you reproducing that for the next person? Is that making sense, or does that sound like gobbledygook? Okay, Dr. Durtschi's with me. We're good. So these are overall what I consider the 10 foundations of connection. Now, for anyone who's listening, if you would like an actual hard copy, I do have like cards that I can send to you. You want to put on your, Dr. Durtschi has hers right there. I am happy to send this to you so you can put it on your pin board, your pegboard, or your refrigerator, or tape it to your bathroom mirror if you feel like these are good reminders that you'd like to have visually. So let's chat about them. First of all, we talk about safety. When we think about safety, we think about physical safety. We teach our young ones to look left, right, left again before they cross the street. We teach them to put a life jacket on when they're out on the water. We teach them to not touch the hot stove, hopefully. Of course, we tell them not to do it, and that means they do it. But we think about all of these things relative to physical safety. But I think an arena where we fall a little bit short as humans is we don't necessarily pay attention to that emotional safety. I actually, when I started doing some research and pulling concepts together, I did a highly scientifically based study by throwing a question out on Facebook. And I asked folks, like, what's a safe place mean to you? And by and large, the respondents were, the responses rather were, it doesn't exist, or I wish I knew because I've never experienced it. Now, for the folks who could name something relative to an emotional safe place, they said it was somewhere that I won't be judged for being authentically me. And that comes up in an array of spaces. Certainly, we see it when, I know, Dr. Durtschi, you navigate this, when families are faced with a diagnosis all of a sudden. Sometimes parents, from what I've seen, don't even want to come to somebody like you because they don't want a label on their kiddo. They don't want to have any perception of being less than in some fashion because they equate a label, a diagnosis with somehow being imperfect. Well, we pass that on to our kids because, hey, you're not perfect. That's not okay. If you're not perfect in this sense, then where else is it not okay to not be perfect? I see it in conversations about next steps in education. Families, I was chatting with one family yesterday where a mom's like, I really want my daughter to go to college. And I asked her point blank, why? What does college mean to you? because your daughter has looked at you and told you point blank she doesn't want to go. Now, I would ask her the same reason. Why don't you want to go? Right? But what is it in the adult perspective that we see as the value in college that will do the daughter good? And do we need to reframe that? So this is where a lot of expectations come in. Certainly we have safety issues in our own homes based on sexuality and gender identity, and all kinds of things around assault, things like victimization. And that, again, do we listen to our kids when they come and tell us somebody touched me inappropriately? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And so this all goes into creating that safe place, validating them, listening to them, and going, yeah, I take what you're saying seriously, and I trust that you're telling me what is true for you, even if it's not what I want to hear. I trust that it's true for you. Whoops, you look like you were going to say something.
Before we go on to the next one, I wanted to, so I happen to have 4 small humans in our household. So I'm a mom of 4 kids, and our first children are twins, and becoming a parent was, I don't know that anybody can prepare you for it. When you say this, creating a safe place, I had to come to understand and identify what my important things were in my life, and also where my biases were of how I view the world. And bias doesn't have to be a positive or a negative thing. It just means how you perceive the world, right? Because when someone else thinks differently from us, it can be very much you need to see it my way type of thing. And so this safe place of open conversation, one of the biggest things that I've learned, I shared this in another webinar, when my husband and I learned that for me to be right didn't mean, when I learned that for me to be right didn't mean that my husband had to be wrong, and vice versa. For him to be right didn't mean that I had to be wrong. I could then kind of settle into a safe place of listening, right? And I think we have to create that for our kids, but we also have to identify our own biases that we have, our own view, our own viewpoint, our own life view, and be able to articulate it for ourselves first, and then, take down somebody else has to do it the way that we do it for it to be right. And that's part of how becoming a parent was one of the hardest, not becoming a parent, but bringing up these human beings and creating a safe space so that they can grow into the wonderful humans that they already are, but grow into these adults has been one of the biggest blessings and challenges of my life, because I have to check my own self all the time. And what I'll find myself doing is I'll pause and we'll come back to it, circle back around to it, and I'll have to talk with David about it, my husband, and then we come back and talk about it again in creating these safe places.
Well,
because
and
they
I
have
really
different views.
Absolutely. I really like that you said it, like you go to your husband because you're married, you're effective co-parents, and the two of you have a relationship where it's okay for you to say, hey, I feel like I'm not comfortable with this, or I'm not doing my best, or I feel like I just mucked that up royally. And you've got that person for yourself to go have this conversation with, right? So he's created that safe place for you, as have you for him, where the two of you can come and have these conversations to sort things out, to then go support your kiddos.
Yeah.
Not every marriage has that.
That's what I was just going to say.
Right.
And not every marriage, not every co-parenting situation, single parenting situation.
Correct.
And so it's so important to have people that have gone down the road a little bit further. Exactly. And they have some perspective, which brings us back to that ParenTween connection.
Which I was just going to say, that's exactly why ParenTween Village is now a thing. It's that community for parents to be like, wow, you know what? My kid just, we just got diagnosed with depression, and we're looking at, do we want to go on meds? What have your experiences been? Are there side effects? What have you seen? This, that, or the other thing. Just having that safe place to talk, again, without fear of recrimination or judgment of yourself or your kids. Yeah. So clearly, create a safe place isn't just about physical safety. It's really about emotional safety. Secondly, the first O that comes up is observe. We know we have the 5 senses, and certainly there are things that we can pay attention to there. Like you can see when, or perhaps you can smell when your child hasn't showered for several days, right? Like those are the obvious
That
things,
never
right?
happens.
And I know that getting your kids to take showers is not a battle that ever happens in anybody's home, because why would they not want to be stinky? I do not understand this. But anyway, right? Like, so there are things that we can see there. You can smell if your kids brought pot home and your kids smoking in their bedroom, like you can probably smell that, right? Like those are the obvious things. But the less obvious things are, or the less obvious things to recognize are more of that social emotional, those feelings. And the reality is that most of us as adults don't know how to identify our feelings overly well, which is why I love that you have Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart on your bookshelf behind you. Because when I talk about observe, I'm talking about looking at the emotions, and I'm talking about looking at them more on a longitudinal perspective, not just like, wow, you haven't showered in 2 days because I can smell you coming in the door, but taking a look at an emotions wheel. Now, Dr. Durtschi, I know you're familiar with this. If you're not, for any of our listeners, literally go Google emotions wheel, and you will find some variation of this. What you'll see is in the middle, you'll have between 5 and 10, depending on which author you're looking at. They have 5 to 10 primary categories of emotions. But then as you move out from them, we get more nuanced and more specific. And many of us as adults have to stop and think about, like, what's the difference between feeling betrayed and disrespected? For some of us, we might use those synonymously. But if we actually looked at the definition, which is why I love Atlas of the Heart, that gets into some really good descriptions about them. And observing how your kids are showing up in the world and being able to have a conversation and be like, hey, you seem really angry. Let's dig into that. And by the way, doing this when they're angry is not a good idea. Like, never in the history of anyone being angry has the phrase calm down actually resulted in somebody calming down. So this is not a conversation that we have when we're in the height of frustration and fury and rage or whatever may be going on. It's really good to go back to and be like, hey, can we dig into that? I seem to sense that you felt like I let you down. Is that right? Or did you feel more embarrassed or humiliated? And helping them have these conversations along the way educates them about their own emotions. But then what I recommend to those of us who have fully formed frontal lobes is that we actually track that over time. Journaling is a good thing. Keeping, even if it's something simple in your phone, like on such and such date, my kid felt this. On such and such next date, my kid felt that. Because then when you are ready to seek professional help, doctors take medical histories. Why wouldn't an emotional support want an emotional history? And if we've got that to provide, it makes it easier to get our kids and ourselves help when we need it.
Yeah. And I think of I call it the Facebook scroll or social media scroll. That dates me with the Facebook scroll, but any type of social media scroll, we tend to see a lot of that happy, the yellow, and maybe surprise, but then we don't see some of these other things. We assume that we only should be experiencing, our human experience should only be isolated to certain ones. But this whole wheel is whole of the human experience, and being able to talk about them, that there is time for our body to experience these feelings of anger, and how to express it appropriately is what we're teaching. But that anger is part of the human experience. Fearful, being let down, all of those things are part of being human, and that we don't need to be afraid of those things necessarily. It's going to be teaching how to respond appropriately, how to feel that inside of our body.
Well, and I remember very clearly, going back to my own experience, I remember being upset and my mom not handling my upset well. Of course, probably because I was upset at her and she realized that maybe she had done something to contribute to my upset. But the response I got from her when I was upset was, oh, you're going to cry? Yeah, you better stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. What does that teach me? I can't have those negative emotions. And oh, by the way, you're not the place for me to go when I have those negative emotions. So in a wham, bam, 1-2 punch, I learned that upset wasn't okay. So I learned to mask.
Yep. I was going to say, you still probably experience those emotions. I'm sure you just learned that that wasn't a safe place to be able to experience
Correct.
the emotion.
Correct.
You still experience them.
Yep. Absolutely. So to folks listening, I would say pick up a copy of Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. Print out one of these emotion wheels and start having the conversations with your kids now. Hey, I watched this webinar today and I learned about this whole new thing called the emotions wheel. Can you distinguish between these two? Because I couldn't. And start these conversations. One of the things that I say to parents over and over and over again, if your kids aren't having these conversations with you, they're either not having them at all, or if they are, they're having them with other people, i.e. their peers. So you, as the adult in their life, have two choices. Do you or do you not want to influence the conversations? I would like to think that we want to influence them in some fashion, whether it's emotions or it's sex or it's drugs or it's whatever. Start having the conversations, and this is a great place to start. All right, so create a safe place, observe, non-judgment. Oh boy, howdy, does this get some fun conversations on Facebook and Instagram and with in other places. Speaking of dating ourselves, I want you to think back to the height of the pandemic and the presidential election here in the States. How many of us were just like, thank God the election is over? Whether you were pleased or displeased with the results of the election, how often after an election of any variety were we just glad it was over because we didn't have to hear the mudslinging and the nastiness, right? But oh, by the way, that happens in our own homes. It's not just all those other people. It happens in our own homes. I remember hearing a parent who was on one side of the mask debate. She was very much pro masks, and I'm not getting into that conversation of what should or shouldn't be. I'm just saying she was pro mask. We happen to live in a county where it was very contentious as to whether masks should be, whether kids should be in school or not in school, masked, unmasked, whatever. Lots of contention. This mom was very firmly on the masking side. And when her kids' schools removed the mask requirements, not shockingly, her daughter started having all kinds of anxiety. Partly, I believe, because her mom had said so much about the dangers, and I'm not saying the dangers weren't there, okay, but like this mom was so fervent about, and I saw and heard a lot of the negative that she had about the people who didn't believe in the masking or didn't believe in vaccines or this, that, and the other thing. And then her 8-year-old daughter was presenting with massive anxiety out of fear of contracting COVID in school without the masks on. Again, I'm not getting into the politics of it or what we believe is right or wrong, but when we are fervent in our beliefs about this is right, to your point about right and wrong, right? And then something comes up that's different, that judgment can negatively impact our kids. So how do we approach this? Well, in that circumstance, I would say it's going to be a challenge because we had such diametric opposites. We had such diametric opposites in the elections, right? Of we're doomed on this side or we're doomed on that side. Bringing it back to our kids and being like, look, this is what we believe is the safest for us and for our family. And no matter what happens, we are going to continue to treat people with respect and do what we believe is right for us, and recognize that our right doesn't mean that somebody else is wrong. I love the way that you put that earlier, because I think so often when we do believe so strongly about something, and I'm only using these two examples because they're very clear examples. These show up all the time, but they're super clear examples of how we're bringing our judgment into things. Other arenas, I see it, like I remember in my experience, my mom was very clear about her stance on sex before marriage and children out of wedlock. And it was very clear to me that should I come home pregnant out of wedlock, there was going to be hell to pay. Again, that showed me that my mom was in a safe space in the event that something had happened. So I think it's one of the best things, what you were already saying, Dr. Durtschi, of like, stepping back to myself and being like, wait a second, how am I approaching this with my kids? Looking at yourself of like, how is some of this judgment coming up? Because I believe this is right. Like, you're a doctor of education. Clearly you believe in education, but what if one of your kids isn't college bound. Where's your judgment on that? You know?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And it's okay to step back and say, you know what? The first thing that in human nature we need is to feel validated, right? So me validating my child and saying, I hear you. I'm hearing your perspective. Let me restate it. I hear you. I need some time to be able to process this. I need some time, but at the end of the day, so one of the things that I can't say that I always do it, but I try to remember in the back of my mind is this idea of, at the end of the day, I love you and we're going to figure this out together. And it's okay to model that you need some time. That's okay, because that's a healthy thing. And so many times we want to be able to have all the answers and things like that. And we'll figure it out together. Right. We're going to figure this out together. At the end of the day, I love you. I care about you. I honor our relationship. And mom just needs some time to think about. But we will see, that was always, for me, something that's hard, is when we don't come back to the conversation and we leave the loop open.
Correct.
And so you feel like that judgment is continuing and perpetuating, and then it gets big in our mind, right? Instead of closing out the loop and coming back and talking about it with a clear head.
Absolutely. The other piece that I'll add in there is, and this is going to tie into challenging your truths a little bit down the road, is that the human brain, to your point of validation, we also need information. When we don't have enough information, our brain fills it in. There has been study after study after study that, not even on the emotional side of things, that like if you have two functioning eyes and you close one or you cover one, your other eye or your brain automatically fills in the missing information that only the one eye can't see. And so we do this.
Isn't that interesting that then our brain remembers that memory, that no one can tell us that it's something different when actually it didn't even happen that way. But our brain is convinced, because our brains naturally want to fill in the gaps. Because it can't have a gap story. It needs to have a reason for things. And that's just, again, that goes back to human nature. And so filling in those gaps, it's going to fill it in, and it's going to feel like that was authentically exactly how it happened. And when actually it may not have happened that way.
Well, and unfortunately, what we do when we do that, in order to make things make sense, again, I'm going to go back to the presidential election or COVID, because those are two very, very clearly delineated circumstances. How can you not see the value in masking? A mask proponent would ask, right? A non-mask proponent would be like, how dare you infringe upon my rights?
Right. And I think there's a lot of danger in our society in general of polar opposites, right? You either are with us, or you're with them, or you're with us, or you're with that, and it's this polarizing where we have a lot more commonalities than we do differences. And there's a lot more gray area than there is this black and white thinking of polar opposites. But in order for society to work and, all of those things that you're talking about, in order to move agendas forward, it has to be polarized, because that's how you get people to vote a certain way. Because on the voting, it's a yes or a no. It's for this person or this person. It's very, polar opposites. And so it's tricky.
What does that do? It creates disconnection, which is not what we're here to talk about. We're talking about how do we connect with people, right? Republicans, Democrats, Martians, humans, whatever, right? And it's that feeling, again, going back to what you were saying of if I'm right, you're wrong. If you're right, I'm wrong. These things are not mutually exclusive. So to that end, how do we find a better way to fill in those gaps? We shut our mouths and we listen to the other person. Zip it, zip it, zip it, zip it, zip it. I think back to, what's the movie Back from Our Day, of the little dude of zip it. I don't want to hear it. Right. I can't think of it right now.
I can't think of it either. Yeah.
But you guys know who I mean, right? In the sales world, if you ever go through any sales training, they tell you that the first person to speak loses, that they lose the negotiation. I actually think that in true connection, the first person to speak wins, which means if you want to have a strong relationship where you feel like your child or your teenager feels valued and validated and heard and like they're quote unquote winning by having a strong relationship, we have to shut up and let them talk. So I'm not going to force you
And
through this
even,
right now. Go ahead.
yeah, even if it's not something that you want to hear, it's most important in those times, because
Absolutely.
it's the validation. To validate someone doesn't mean that you're saying that they are completely right.
Mhm.
Validating someone is that you're listening to them, that you're validating that they are important to you.
Mhm.
And by being quiet and listening, we're demonstrating you're important to me and I want to hear what you have to say.
Absolutely. And here's the thing. We so often listen to respond. We don't
Mhm.
listen to understand. What's the difference? Well, think back to a situation where you had a heated debate with your partner, your employer, your employee, your kid, whatever, where things kind of went off the rails. And think about when they said something that you felt attacked, because it happens anytime we end up with disconnection. It's like, wow, well, mom, I hate you. That hurts. I have to imagine. I mean, again, not being a mom, I haven't been on the receiving end of it, but that's gotta hurt to hear. Well, do you get defensive or do you go, yeah, I get it. I get that you don't like my response in this case, and that's okay, but I still love you. Right? I understand that you're upset about the fact that you can't go to the party tonight. You're hearing them, but you're not letting it like attack you directly. But what I like to encourage folks to do is when you hear something, or when your kiddo says something, especially with kids, because remember, their frontal lobes are not fully developed until they're like 25. So they're not going to process the same way that we do as adults. Count to 30, like literally zip it and count to 30. And if they start talking, start counting again. Let them get it all out. And then have like a half a dozen responses ready to go. Be like, wow, I never would have thought about it that way. Or, that's different than what I was expecting. Or tell me more. An invitation to get them to keep talking. And then
Yeah. And I like
go ahead.
I like how none of those were fixing it.
None.
Many times they just need to feel heard. I would say that the vast majority of families that I work with here, when they come, they feel unheard. They're not trying to be adversarial necessarily towards anyone, any school, anything like that. It's wow, nobody's just listened to our journey. Nobody understands, and I may not understand exactly what they're going through. I can empathize, but just for me to be quiet and listen to their journey, their experience, it's a similar thing. We're not trying to fix it necessarily at that moment. It's just to allow them to get it out and to be heard and feel validated in that.
Well, and I also want to add in a thought relative to parenting teenagers or to being a mentor to teenagers. I think part of the reason that kids talk to me or people like me or like you or other mentors more so than they talk to parents is that when the kids are little, like with some of your littles, right? You're still the authoritarian. You're still the one making the important decisions for them. And you need to be. But as they're getting to that age where your older kids are now, they're what, 12, 13, 14?
Yeah, my oldest are 13.
Okay. Your role as mom isn't the dictator anymore. Your role as mom now is mentor in essence, in a lot of cases, and giving them the space to learn to do for themselves what you've been doing for them up until now.
Yep. And it's super tricky because they're 13 going on 20 sometimes. You're like,
right.
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 Where's the balance on that? And like I said, having parents that have gone through those teenage years, being able to say, hey, that similar thing has come up for me. Here's how we went through it, is very valuable.
Well, and modeling your thinking is really important at this point. So to your point of like not fixing it, but being like, well, what are some of your options? Like if I was in your shoes, I would stop and think about what are some of my options of how I could take the next step? What might my next step be? And if they don't know, another really good way to invite them to consider it would be like, well, what would your best friend say? Or somebody else who is in a situation, what do they see as the options? But literally giving them the space without you fixing it, giving them the space, number one, to get it out. And number two, to just hear what they're saying without fixing it is critical. And then to the point of modeling your thinking, helping them explore what their next best steps could be. Okay, you don't want to go to college. All right, you know what? College is one avenue post high school. It's the one that I might think is the most effective to get you to a happy, successful, financially stable situation. But if that's not the route that you want to go, what other options do you see? And exploring, working with a career coach, going and doing some internships, going and doing some volunteerism, shadowing, things like that, exploring the military. Now, as a mom, the thought of military might absolutely terrify you. Like, I get that. And if your kid is equally terrified about college, we don't necessarily want them having that mental health side of things either, So just modeling that thought, talking to other people, talking to other parents, bringing in professionals like you or like me or like, others who know our industries and can give guidance as to what other options might be. Looking at this as well for ourselves, like if you suspect that your kiddo maybe isn't 100% heteronormative, right? Or heterosexual, go do your research first so that you are educated and know what LGBTQIA plus stands for, know what non-binary means. And again, this comes back to the non-judgment. If you're in a belief system where it's this or this, end of story, maybe your kid doesn't believe the same thing that you do. It's on us to go explore and educate ourselves about some of these other beliefs so that we can have reasonable conversations with them. So I'm going to turn off the phone that's ringing in the background. Sorry about that. So exploring and educating, going, get curious. What other ways could this be that are different from what my experience might be? Because I guarantee you, the harder you dig your heels in about something, this is just human nature. The harder you push that you're right and make me wrong, oh, friend, we're going to have words. Just saying. It's disconnecting. When you're not willing to learn about my experience, it's disconnecting.
And I like that this word is explore. It doesn't mean you're making decisions yet. It doesn't mean that there's one pathway. You're just exploring all of your options of what is possible and talking with people that have been down the road a little bit longer. And it made me think of the next one, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's where we're going. Please offer me a segue.
The segue of exploring these options, you have to challenge your own truth, your own idea of what it should be. So taking your example of the college, that might have been my path. It may not be my children's path. And that's okay. Educating myself. And sometimes I feel like I'm trying to just stay a few steps ahead of them sometimes. But challenging my truth and taking a pause that I don't have to have all the answers, and that what I internally checking my own bias about from my past, what has taught me that that's the way to do it. And maybe it is the best way for our children, but maybe a different pathway is equally as beneficial for them.
And here's the thing though, is maybe it is the case that college is the best fit or the best long-term plan. The harder we push that on somebody who doesn't agree yet, the harder they're going to push back.
And it's surprising that when you start to explore, when you start to look at those things, they're kind of challenging their own truth too, to figure it out. And it may be that they land on that college is the best option, but now there's investment in it because they have explored all the other things with your guidance, talking about it, opening that conversation with them, that they're challenging their own ideas and truths. and biases about
Absolutely.
things. And it may be
Well,
that they end up that college is the best choice for them.
exactly. And here's the thing. There is no way. Oh man, I remember going back. My mom was always like, mother knows best. And maybe she did in a lot of cases. Mother knows best about mother sometimes, many times. But you know what? I mean, how many times as a human being have you been like, wow, I thought this was the way to go? And oh no, how many times did we kiss frogs along the way when we were sure they were going to be it, right? And so here's the thing, if we can't even be 100% correct about something for ourselves, how dare we think that we are 100% correct about something for another human being? Granted, you might have birthed that human being, and maybe you really do. It will turn out that yes, what you believe is best is ultimately best for them. The way that we approach it, again, we're talking about connection. You know, I remember some of the frogs I kissed. My mother was very clear that she didn't think they were my Prince Charming. My mother also didn't think that my husband was my Prince Charming. And we just celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary. You know, but here's the thing, we can't know everything. You're a mom of 13-year-olds. You've never been a mom of a 13-year-old until you were a mom of a 13-year-old. You're still learning. When your kids are 25, it will be the first time that you're a mom of a 25-year-old. And the more that you come back to, hey, you know what? I don't know everything. You're empowering them to not have to have all the answers as well. And if you look at it like
that's part of our human experience, right?
It totally is.
These are life things, life coaching things of that we may not have the answers, and the relationship is very important. That at the end of the day, we're going to figure it out together.
Absolutely. And the two questions that I like to offer when I talk about challenging your truths are what if and what else? What if I don't know everything? Because I guarantee you don't. All right, none of us does. What if there's something else at play that I'm totally not thinking about? And then that brings us to the what else. What else could be at play? What else could be going on that we haven't gotten to yet? And then that comes back to exploring and nodding and smiling and not saying things, like asking questions, exploring with this other human being, just like you said you do with your husband, right? Where you're like, wow, my kiddo came home with this today and this was totally out of left field and I'm just really not sure what to do with it. And like you guys explore back and forth. Great, but go explore with the kiddo and be like, hey, I don't understand XYZ. Can you help me understand? I don't know, as a human who fully, cisgendered or cis female, born female, assigned female at birth, only ever identified as female. I cannot understand from my own experience what it's like to not feel like a woman. There are plenty of people out there who have had that experience. So if I can be like, hey, what does it feel like? What was your first inclination? How did this first feel? Whatever the case may be, asking them about their own experiences, number one, gives them an opportunity to feel heard and validated. But number two, can also educate me about what that's like. I had an opportunity to mentor somebody who actually went through a gender transition from female to male. And I met this individual initially when he then was identified as female still, and asked me, hey, Clarrisa, what happens in this particular organization that we were involved with if I transition? I didn't know what they meant by transition. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. It just hadn't been something in my world. So when people say to me, oh, well, I don't know anybody who blah, 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 whatever. You don't know that. Again, challenge your truths. Are you sure you don't know anyone who? Because you probably do, but depending on how you've approached that in the past, you may not be that safe place for them to be open about it. This particular individual was amazing. I could not have asked for a better guide through this particular arena, because she has since transitioned to he. And in the process, like my approach, like even when I see you sometimes, I'll be like, hey lady, how you doing? Right? Because you identify as a female, we're two women, that's how we relate to each other. Well, as she was transitioning to he, that became inappropriate and disrespectful. But he was always super cool about like, hey, this is new for you, but it's not new for me. And I'm going to be gracious with you as you learn. And wow, I couldn't have asked for a better mentor. I went and I did some exploring. Like I came home and I said to Joe, I'm like, what the heck does this person mean by transition? Well, he had coached women's football for a long time. So he knew more about it than I did. He was a great place for me. And I went to Google and I went to other people who were more knowledgeable in the arena to learn. Because there's always more. So challenge your truths, get curious. I've never thought about it like that. How else could I explore? Like, what else could I learn about this? Anyway, I could go on. This is probably one of my favorites. I know you've seen this with your kiddos, and I know you see this with the kids, the folks that you work with, the families that you work with. Like nothing happens immediately, right? We've got the diagnosis process, and then we've got, well, what does it really mean? You know, if we're dealing with autism, what levels of autism are we dealing with? What does that mean? How does that show up for this kiddo versus that kiddo, or ADHD or dyslexia, or whatever the case may be? Like there's that exploration process. There's also an adjustment process and learning how to do new things. It doesn't happen overnight. Humans don't change overnight. It takes time. But it's the most frustrating because it's like, I want it changed now. Now that I know this, I want all the magic.
And I think that there's comfort actually in knowing that things will take time and that there's the process, and knowing that people will be there beside you through that process, but knowing that it doesn't have to, it's not going to change tomorrow. Let's do today what we can do today, and then we'll take the next step. Once we've taken that next step, we're going to look around, reevaluate, and then take the next step that makes sense. But knowing there's, for me, there's comfort in knowing that it will take time. Yes, it can be frustrating, and yes, why can't it change now? But knowing that things will take time and that we'll have help along the way is comforting.
And that as we change, others change with us. Again, that'll come to the next O when we get there. But just know that it's not going to happen overnight, and that's okay, because especially if we're talking relationships, like interpersonal things don't devolve overnight usually. I mean, there can be a single massive breach of trust, but barring that, there are incremental situations or incremental circumstances that lead to disconnect. It takes time to get there. It's going to take time to recreate connection as well. So take the time. It's okay. It's normal. Innovate. How can we do this differently? And this is, I think, really important with teenagers, especially. I've seen this come up. One of my best friends is neurotypical, and she has an ADHD son. And she lovingly calls him her honey badger because he challenges her in absolutely every way, shape, and form. And part of that, it's not like he's trying to be a jerk. He just functions differently than she does. And she's like, I am tired of nagging him. I am tired of getting on his case. I'm tired of all the, just the frustrating things. And so I was actually at their house this weekend, and among some of my recent explorations have been in the ADHD world. And one of the things that I found was when you're trying to do a task, say the name of the task out loud over and over and over and over. So I just said to him, hey kiddo, your mom asked you to take out the trash 3 times. How about we get it taken out? And while you're doing it, how about you say out loud, trash, 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 trash. But then let me ask you, what's the next step? And he goes, oh, I got to put a bag back in the bucket. I was like, great. So as soon as you take the trash out to the outside trash bin, I want you to change from saying trash to trash bag, trash bag, trash bag, because that'll give you a verbal, an audible cue to remember to go get the trash bag and put it back in the bin, because he's going to get distracted by the time he gets back in the house. I guarantee it. And he tried it. And he's like, wow, Miss Clarrisa, that worked. So I gave him an idea in that case. I was like, let's try it. Let's explore it. But in another circumstance, she was like, okay, bud. She's like, I don't know how else to approach this. I want you to go to YouTube, because he's on YouTube all the time. She's like, I want you to go to YouTube, and I want you to do your exploring. I want you to come up with 3 ways that we can try to handle this situation. So, because I'm tired of arguing with you about it. And I have to imagine you're tired of me nagging you. So why don't you go find solutions that you can try? So this is where exploring and innovating. How can we do this differently? Give it to them. Let them figure it out. Because I guarantee you, they're as frustrated about you nagging them as you are about nagging them. but you give them a chance to be like, hey, you be your own hero. You find the solution. If you can find something that works, I'm in.
Yeah, this relates for me with one of the many things that I appreciate about my husband is he's such a great innovator. He can think of many, many options because of the way he thinks. He's a very spatial thinker. I'm a very sequential thinker where give me a checklist. Once we figure out the idea that we want to do, I'm the one that can help drive our family to get the follow through, right? Sometimes for me, coming up with all of the ideas can be very difficult.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a good or a bad. It's just that that's not my area of strength. For my
Yeah.
husband, he's able to fill that gap for me. And I rely a lot more on him when he's going to be doing the surprise type of things. And then I'm like, well, that sounds like a fantastic idea. Let's make it happen for our family. And so innovating and thinking up alternate solutions, I think does come after you've challenged, once you've challenged your own truth, and when we say truth, it doesn't have to be, it can be our ideas, our way of doing things. When we challenge those things, this innovation can then start to happen in coming up with alternative solutions. In school, it's a great example of that, how we've always done school. The sit and get technique is what I call it. Innovations, what if, you mentioned that, what if we tried it a different way? What if we allowed students to present in an authentic way for them? I appreciate my daughter's online social studies teacher, for example, and math too. Both of them have given multiple opportunities for her to demonstrate her thinking, and she's neurodifferent. Like, she thinks differently than a sit and get technique. And they have allowed her to do 3D projects that relate to what they're studying right now in ancient China. A compare and contrast between two different types of movies, a realistic movie and then the animation version, and making those connections. She was doing some writing last night, and I'm like, she's doing writing. Like, I'm like doing cartwheels because of this innovation of this teacher, the specific teacher, of thinking about it a different way. And not necessarily the way that works for him the best, but maybe something that, but for my daughter, having that opportunity to innovate and think differently about things, she's learned so much about, ancient China that she may not have otherwise.
Right. Well, and that builds, I mean, that goes into so many other of on the social emotional side of things, like that confidence building. If we kept to a certain structure and you don't fit my structure, you're not good enough. What does that do for self-esteem and confidence and capacity and all the other things that come down the road, right? How does that help a kid become a functional human contributing adult? I would propose that it doesn't, but that is getting on my high horse and my soapbox. Anyway, to round this out, our last two. Own your own story. Now you will see in there that I also have own your own S asterisk asterisk asterisk. Please feel free to use whichever S word you feel applies. Here's the thing. This comes back to like you saying like, hey, I never thought about it like this. What's right for me versus what's right for my kid. At the end of the day, the only person that we can control is ourselves. And the longer we try to control the humans that we're influencing, the harder it's going to be to maintain connection with them, especially as they age up into the teenage and 20s. That flaming rag there represents a thought that I got from the first life coach I ever worked with. He said to me, he said, our collective experiences are like a wash rag that has gasoline on it. And when someone says or does something that is like a match, it can turn that rag into this monstrous fire, this huge conflagration. And I see this happening over and over and over in families where mom or dad have this experience, whatever it is, call it trauma, negative experience in the background, and their kid says or does something, and mom or dad loses it, and they're like, what the heck? My kid is being such a bleepity bleepity blop. No, your kid's not being a bleepity bleepity blop. Your kid has triggered something in you most often. Again, this is from my experience. I'm not a mental health professional, but from what I've seen, if you respond in a way that you're like, I recognize that was just way out of proportion to what the circumstance was, the likelihood is that there's something from your own experience that's being triggered. I had this happen when something came up in my family after my mom passed. My dad, did something that I was like, totally in his own right. Like, looking at it now, I recognize like it wasn't totally to like piss me off or something. It was just his own thing, that his step that he needed to take. But oh man, did I recognize that I had such a visceral reaction. And thankfully, I've done enough of my own work and owning my own story that I have my therapist on speed dial. And I texted her and I was like, help, because, oh, holy cow. And we were able to dig in and figure out what it was that was latent for me that this action had triggered. And I was just like off the rails with it. That often happens in our partnerships and with our kids. I think from what I've seen, that if there's an arena that is a human being where you need to develop, you're going to get a kid that pushes you to do that. Just saying.
And normalizing that, you mentioned a therapist, like normalizing that that's okay to ask for help. It's okay to own our own story in a way of working through the stuff that has affected us, coming to where we are now. My husband is a counselor and he works with a lot of male teens and in their early 20s, because one of the reasons that he was kind of drawn into that is because it isn't normalized, especially for boys. For boys, for men, that you got to toughen up, you got to be a man type of thing. That if you're owning your own story, that's weakness, that's blame, that's all of these things. And so speaking to another man about owning our own story and owning what part is ours and the what if questions and types of things, that's very healthy to be able to work through some of those things. That as we own our own story, we then create space. It's like cleaning out our closets, instead of shoving it closed. When we clean it out, we now have room for other things. When we clean out our own stories, clean out our own things that are holding us back, we allow space for those in our life that we want to connect with.
And not only normalizing therapy and normalizing owning and healing our own wounds, as it were, but saying to others, like, I never remember my mom coming back to me and going, wow, you know what? I handled that really poorly. I'm sorry. I'm still upset about your behavior, but my behavior wasn't great either. I had this with a friend of mine. I sing, I'm in a competitive singing organization. And this woman, man, I have so much respect for her. She's currently in our regional champion quartet, and they actually made it to the top 10 at internationals last year. And as we were going on the stage for our holiday show, I was really nervous, like super, super, super nervous. And she had made some comment about nerves. And my initial response to her was, yeah, but you don't get nervous the way I do. And I went back and I was like, wow, you know what? That was really rotten of me to say. How do I know what her experience of it is? I don't. And so I went to her later and I was like, you know what? I want to apologize. That really wasn't fair of me to say. What is true is you don't show the nerves the way that I feel like I do. But I'm not in your brain. I'm not in your heart. I don't know what you're feeling. I don't know that you don't get nervous the way that I do. But wow, you handle it so well. And I have so much respect for you. And she was like, you know what? I really appreciate that you acknowledge it, because holy crap, do I get nervous? And so that was like an opportunity for me to disconnect from her. And I recognized that I didn't handle it in the most respectful way that I would have liked to. And I went back and wow, we've gotten a whole lot closer. And I'm not going to say that that was like the thing that did it, but at least it was like a stitch that could have unraveled, that I at least went back and put a knot in and was like, hey, I'm sorry. It's how often do we do that with our kids?
Yeah.
I remember my dad did it once. Actually, he's done it a few times now, more so since I've been an adult even. But then again, it goes back to you haven't had a daughter who's 13 or a child who's 13. He's never had a kid who's 44 that's navigating things with him now where I'm at, where he's at. So he's still learning just as I am. So owning your own stuff, we're the only ones we can control, but we can influence a whole lot. And a huge amount of that is owning our own stuff. Last piece is nurture. And this goes back to the take your time. We have to take time to nurture things for ourselves and for the people that we love. So date time with your partner, date night once a month, date night with each of your kids once a month, once every couple of months, whatever works in your family dynamic, taking that time to be like, hey, you're important to me, and this time together is important to me.
Yeah. With nurturing, I always think of when you're on the airplane and you're sitting in the seats and they're doing the presentation of all the safety check. And I kid you not, even when I had littles, like toddlers, flying with toddlers, not fun, but many times the stewardess or steward person would come by. What are the flight attendant?
Attendants.
The flight attendant, see? Flight attendant would come by and they would check in with me to say to me, make sure you put your mask on first and then help your kids. That nurturing of, I'm glad that you mentioned nurturing ourselves, and that acknowledging that I haven't been a mom of 13-year-olds before, and I'm going to make oopses and I'm going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And to model that, how do I, when I do make a mistake, how do I own it? And modeling, how do I repair the relationship if there is any repair to be done, like how do I approach that? And it's interesting. Some of the most powerful times have been when I'm like, man, I feel like I really messed up. And literally sitting down with my then 10-year-old and saying, you know what, I didn't handle that the way I want to. I want to let you know why, maybe why I responded that way. And at the end of the day, I love you and I want our relationship to be really good. And I'm sorry for the way that, mom grumped at you and just needed it to be done. And so, but in that, it allowed them to open up. And it was a really, really cool moment of bonding with my then 10-year-old about them understanding that mom is going to have oopses too. And then it's okay for me to have oopses. I need to make repairs for it, but it's okay that I'm going to be human and have an oops too.
And I think that also speaks to another topic that somehow we haven't discussed today because it didn't come up in the conversation, but making a clear distinction between the human being and the human behavior. Right?
If you can solve that, if you can come and bring that into school systems, oh my goodness, like, yes, there is a reason for the behavior that we're seeing presented, let's say at school, is very different from that human being. Sometimes it's telling us that there's something going on. But I have yet to meet a child that intentionally wants to make a teacher mad or make the adults in their life mad, that really, really is like intent that making it mad for no good reason at all.
Right. It's
many times need. It's an unmet need, and many times the sense of, I don't want to be vulnerable, and therefore I push it away. You got to get away from me. It's too many messages. Get away from me. I need my space so that I can, they're not thinking that process through. But man, if you could solve that, we'll have a lot less suspensions at school for sure.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it even starts at home. In our personal relationships, you made a mistake. You're not a bad person. Right? You behaved poorly. You behaved in a manner that came off as very disrespectful to me.
Yeah.
But let's dig into that. Why is that you behaved in that way? Oh, wait, maybe it's because I tuned you out, and because I didn't stop and listen to you and give you the space to feel heard, seen, and understood. And if I have done that consistently, then yeah, you're going to be an ass.
Yeah.
Let's call it what it is, because we do the same thing. How many times in our employment or in our marital situation do we look at our partner and be like, you're not listening to me, you're not hearing me, right? And so yeah, I'm going to go down the path of behaving poorly in my marriage. I'm going to treat my partner poorly if I'm not feeling like my needs are met. But wait, am I speaking up about my needs, and or is my partner validating them? It happens between grown adults too. So I can guarantee you it's going to happen with kids.
Yeah.
But that also comes back to, like you're saying, nurturing. If you're tapped out as a human being, you're not going to show up as a mom. You're not going to show up as a partner. You're not going to show up as an employer or as a business owner or as an advocate the way that you'd like to if you are tapped out. I know you and I have had these conversations where we've been there, done that, right? When you're just so exhausted, or you're sick or whatever, or you're just overwhelmed and you just need to like take that time out, like put yourself in the corner.
Right. Right.
You know, it's perfectly valid to be like, mama needs a time out. Let me go and just meditate.
It's actually,
or
yeah,
or whatever.
it's actually very healthy to do that, because then it models for our children and those around us how then when they feel that way, what possibilities they could do. Well, Clarrisa, it's been such a pleasure to be with you today. If people want to continue this conversation, can you let them know how? There we go. So if you would like to, for our listeners, if you'd like to connect with Clarrisa and her ParenTween Village, if you need that village around you, and reach out to Clarrisa. She's an amazing resource, and online for the ParenTween, you can just look up ParenTween on even Facebook, and she's got some great Facebook groups on there.
Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I do want to throw a shout out. We are doing an event between Mother's Day and Father's Day called Empower-a-thon. We do have a leg of our organization, the ParenTween Foundation, that is nonprofit. And our mission is to be able to help bridge the gap that so frequently exists between professionals like you and me and families' budgets. The reality is we, as professionals, we have what we need to charge in order to keep roofs over our heads as businesses. But a lot of times, especially with current environment and economy being what they are, families' budgets can't always swing it. So the goal of ParenTween Foundation is to help bridge that gap. And so Empower-a-thon is going to be a series of webinars kind of like this, but where we're going to straight up ask folks at the end, hey, if you just got value out of this, please take this link and go make a donation to help families gain more access. And our goal is 100 speakers. We're at about 55, I think, right now. Between Mother's Day and Father's Day here in the US, we've got speakers from as far away as England, Australia, Thailand, all over the place, who have just amazing things to share. So tune in and join us.
Awesome. Yeah. You can also join us on Navigating Education. Our social media is going to be at Navigating EDU. And we're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We have not switched over to Twitter. It's just because of my own comfort zone.
So, yeah, I don't love it either.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Clarrisa, for joining us today. And thank you for bringing ParenTween Connection to fruition. Yeah. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for being part of our network.
You bet. Thank you.